Welcome to the Sri Lankan Understanding, a platform on which we explore the past taken by Sri Lanka, an island in the Indian Ocean. We look at the present and we look at the potential for the future. Our topic for discussion today is addressing Sri Lanka's Forex Challenges, looking at where we are right now, why we are facing certain obstacles in our path. To discuss this, we've invited a much sought after economist who is one of the youngest to sit on the board of directors in this country. He is currently the research director at Verite Research. Deshal de Mel. Thank you very much, Deshal, for your time today.
My pleasure, George.
Deshal, let's dive straight into the deep end. Why are we facing a drastic drop in our foreign reserves?
So I would put it down to three primary reasons. So the first is the fact that Sri Lanka today is paying down its external debts by using foreign reserves. Typically, a middle-income country like Sri Lanka would be rolling over the maturing liabilities by accessing global financial markets, but we lost access to global financial markets about 2 years ago, and as a result, we are effectively paying our debts by running down the reserves that we have. So that's the biggest cause, the primary reason. A secondary reason is, of course, associated with the pandemic, the fact that we had key inflows such as tourism being adversely affected over the last 2 years. We're just starting to see the first signs of recovery now, but that is certainly one critical factor that has affected the reserves as well. And then, of course, the other source of outflows is the fact that our imports have increased largely because of global commodity price increases. So we've seen products like oil, milk powder, all of which the global prices have increased quite dramatically, and that has been an additional drain on our reserves as well. So the increase in the cost of imports, the decline in tourism, but primarily I would say is the fact that we've been using our reserves to pay off our maturing debt liabilities.
This is not something unique to Sri Lanka. There are challenges countries are facing around the world owing to the pandemic chiefly, and that has really set our countries back and of course become a huge challenge for economic governance in countries. But what's the unique nature about Sri Lanka's situation? Yes, we are using our foreign reserve to pay for our imports, but is curtailing imports the solution? Is stopping it the solution? What is unique about the Sri Lankan experience?
Yeah, you're right, George. There are certainly challenges that we are seeing in the global economy as well. So we've seen inflation picking up quite dramatically in many countries around the world, advanced economies, middle-income economies, etc. And that is again due to a combination of I would say two factors. You've seen certain supply chain bottlenecks associated with the pandemic, but of course combined with surging global demand as well because of the stimulus that has been provided by many of the global central banks. So with this sharp rise in demand, combined with supply chain bottlenecks, we've seen global prices of many items rising. We mentioned a couple previously: fuel, cooking gas prices, many construction materials. So that is a phenomenon that we've seen around the world, and that is certainly a challenge that many economies are struggling to deal with right now. So Sri Lanka faces the same challenges, being a very much an import-oriented economy. But Sri Lanka's challenges are compounded by the more unique foreign exchange challenges that we have. So Sri Lanka, given the fact that we have been using our limited forex reserves to pay down our maturing debt, that has left us with very limited supply of US dollars or foreign exchange to be able to pay for our essential imports. As a result of that, we have seen challenges for companies to open letters of credit to import key commodities, key inputs into the manufacturing process, all of which has contributed to a further increase in prices in imported items in Sri Lanka, and of course uncertainty in supplies. We've seen shortages of certain products at different times, various challenges around that as well. So Sri Lanka's problems are really a combination of what we're seeing globally with regard to price escalations and inflation, combined with the unique factors that are resulting from our own foreign exchange problems.
So is that the solution? Is that what is normally done in terms of tapping into, maybe to some extent use the word draining your foreign reserves at a time like this? Are there any other ways out of it that we might be able to see elsewhere?
Yeah, so typically, George, what happens is middle-income countries like Sri Lanka, what they would do is many countries have borrowed from global markets. What you would typically do is to continue to access capital markets to be able to refinance the capital portion of your maturing debt, and you continue to pay off your interest, and you go on like that. Now, Sri Lanka's problems really escalated when our credit ratings were downgraded around April 2020. And that has made it difficult for us to continue to access global capital markets. So really the path out of this challenge in the say the medium to longer term is for Sri Lanka to regain access to global capital markets. To do that, we need to upgrade our credit ratings. Then we are able to not have to use our reserves to settle debt, but we can continue to roll over our debt maturities as they go along, and then be able to have a reasonable balance of reserves to meet any kind of challenging or risky situations, and of course to provide the required reserves to pay for our imports that are required for a normal economy to run.
Absolutely. Deshal, when we come back after the break, I want to look at the pandemic, its direct impact on the situation in the country, how this has drawn us back, and what implications this will have in the years ahead, when we return on our next segment of the Sri Lankan Understanding. Welcome back to the Sri Lankan Understanding. We're in conversation with Deshal de Mel, and we're talking about the need to address the Forex challenges of this country. Deshal, before the break, you looked at the global perspective, how it's having an impact directly on us. This is not a challenge only in Sri Lanka, but around the world. But our problem is probably that much more complex in terms of what is happening over here. If we look at the pandemic only, if it's possible to examine it in a vacuum, what direct impact has that had on us, and what impact will it have in the years ahead?
Yeah, so if you look at the three factors that we spoke about in earlier on in the previous segment, we spoke about how Sri Lanka's reserves have declined due to repayments of debt using reserves, due to the decline in key sources of inflow such as tourism, and then also the impact on the rising import prices. Now, of these, certainly tourism can be, the decline in tourism is obviously explained, very easily explained by the pandemic. We've seen that in several countries that rely on tourism, in say Thailand for instance. Maldives is probably a more special case given their geographical dispersion. It's easier to manage tourism in a pandemic environment than say a country like Sri Lanka or Thailand. Out of the other factors, we've also seen a sharp decline in remittances in the last 6 months, but that is not really due to the pandemic. We've seen many of our neighboring countries in the region have actually seen continued growth in remittances both in 2020 and in 2021. So Sri Lanka's challenges around the decline in remittances cannot really be explained by the pandemic, but more due to some of the foreign exchange mismatches that we see. So right now we have a very sharp divergence between the official exchange rate and the exchange rate in the informal markets, or the black market as it is called. As a result of that, we are seeing remittances flows being diverted from official channels into informal channels. So in the second half of 2021, the latter 6 months, we saw remittances declining by 48% year on year. And that is certainly something that cannot be explained by the pandemic, but more due to some of the unique policy situations in Sri Lanka. And of course, the third factor we spoke about, rising import costs, import prices. That again probably can be explained by the pandemic, given the fact that what we are seeing in the global context as well, with supply bottlenecks, largely due to pandemic-oriented factors. Now, those situations, so we are already seeing a gradual normalization of tourism as the world starts to learn to live with the pandemic in the way that it has been. We are also likely to see a normalization of global supply chains, and then therefore global prices should also be gradually normalized going forward. But of course, our challenges that we face with regard to the Forex situation, with regard to reserves, that is something that is not going to be addressed by the pandemic being resolving itself on its own. That requires more deliberate, intentional policy measures on our part to be able to really come out of that part of the problem.
Mm-hmm. If we talk about budgets and public finance management, how can they be used to address the declining confidence in Sri Lanka, in the economy?
So I would think that a big part of addressing Sri Lanka's reserves and Sri Lanka's ability to access global markets is really dependent on our public finance management. So if we look back over the last couple of years and try to understand where these challenges first really started to kick in to Sri Lanka, I mentioned earlier that the decline in our credit ratings was a key factor, right? So in Sri Lanka was at about a credit rating of about B minus amongst the key rating agencies. We got downgraded in successive periods over the last 2 years, and a lot of those downgrades have followed the passage of Sri Lanka's budgets. So what's happened is the credit rating agencies have not really been able to draw confidence from the fiscal path that Sri Lanka has had. So we have in each year in the budget we would project expected revenue, we project expected expenditure, and if the markets do not consider that to be a credible projection, and they see that this is going to result in budget deficits widening, contributing to additional debt generation in the future, then credit rating agencies are likely to downgrade countries like Sri Lanka, and that is exactly what happened. So really, in order to get back onto an upward path in our credit rating, in our credit ratings, the first step would be to address our fiscal path, our fiscal sustainability. And again, towards that, so in the last 2 years, we've had budget deficits of 10% of GDP and above, and that is very high compared to global standards, even in a pandemic situation. So what Sri Lanka needs to do is to chart out a sustainable path of bringing this 10% plus budget deficit down to a more manageable level, to single-digit levels certainly, going towards around 5% in the medium term. And that of course requires a multitude of measures. It requires measures to enhance Sri Lanka's tax collection ability, rationalization of some of the expenditure as well. So there is a certain amount of tightening that is required on that front. If Sri Lanka is able to do that, to demonstrate a credible path towards more sustainable budgets, more sustainable fiscal management, our credit rating can improve. That way then we can regain access to global capital markets, replenish our foreign exchange reserves, and then slowly come back to a path of normalcy. So it's a long road ahead. It's not something that can be done overnight, but it's something that we need to start on as soon as possible.
Exactly. It is certainly a long path ahead. Is one of the short-term measures then increasing the flow of currency, of printing money, I mean, to use a very layman's term, printing money in order to ensure that we don't have a shortage? But isn't that in the long term a bit risky? Where you have, look at certain countries, Zimbabwe for example, where things cost thousands, lakhs for simple items. The value of the currency had really gone down at that point. Isn't that a direct fear that we have when we keep printing money?
Yeah, great question, George. I mean, we've seen a lot of countries in response to the pandemic where we've seen the economic activity collapsing. Many countries have printed money in order to continue to maintain liquidity and to maintain economic activity at some semblance of a pace. Now the key is that you need to be able to withdraw that stimulus at the right time. So once the economy starts to recover, once it comes back on its own feet, at that point you need to be able to withdraw stimulus, otherwise you risk overheating. And what we are seeing actually even globally is a degree of overheating of economies, which is why we are seeing even in the US, inflation has gone up to over 7%, the highest it's been since the 1980s. So many countries have struggled to kind of find the right time to withdraw this stimulus. I would say Sri Lanka is probably one of them as well. So certainly, even though the printing of money, as we say in simple terms, I wouldn't attribute it as the key or the main cause of the rise in inflation in Sri Lanka right now. There's a lot of supply side dynamics that have contributed to that, but certainly it is necessary to withdraw that stimulus at the right time in order to prevent inflation going up into uncontrollable levels. And that is again, as I said, something that many countries have been struggling to find that to strike that right balance.
You've got to know that correct point to start doing that. So
absolutely. So I think the Central Bank of Sri Lanka has, since the latter part of 2021, been gradually trying to withdraw this stimulus, but it is again, there are many lags in the efficacy of monetary policy, so it's not an easy balance to strike. So Sri Lanka is right now trying to strike that balance to prevent those risks really manifesting in a bigger way going forward.
Something I also want to look at, Deshal, is when we talk about going to international financial institutions, there's certain reservations. Maybe the term IMF now has become almost a three-letter bad word now. Why is that? The IMF has sound policies. Yes, the IMF, the World Bank, the ADB, whatever international financial house we go to, they do have their conditions because they want the money back at some point. They're not giving you a gift. It's not a grant. They want it back. So they set conditions. But how do we balance that out in terms of what is in our national interest? We need the money, but how do we also balance out the long-term impact of it?
Yeah, so institutions like the IMF have an important role for countries in situations that Sri Lanka faces itself in. So right now we have a sharp decline in our foreign exchange reserves. We are struggling to meet in our payment obligations, whether it's for imports or whether it's for debt repayment. So in that kind of situation is when you would go to a lender of last resort like the IMF. Now, institutions like the IMF, I would say more than the quantum of money that they would provide in the form of a loan or as a part of a program, what really the difference that they can make is in terms of signaling confidence. So any creditor will know that, look, if a country is part of an IMF program, then they have a certain structure in place in terms of their fiscal path, their macroeconomic path, and that gives other lenders also confidence that, look, hey, these guys have a stable structure going forward. So we can also now draw confidence and be able to lend money to them. So really institutions like the IMF can help unlock sources of finance for countries like Sri Lanka in the kind of situation that we are in. And that, as you quite rightly said, that doesn't come, there's no free lunch. There are certain strictures within which you need to operate in order to be able to access that. And of course, all that comes down to negotiation. So it is up to the two parties, the government of Sri Lanka in this case, and say the IMF, to negotiate a program which strikes a balance between ensuring a degree of prudence to make sure that we're not having wastage or we're not wasting the money that we would be receiving, and at the same time not being overly stifling to really hurt economic recovery as well. So it's incumbent upon the government of Sri Lanka in this case to really come up with a plan to take that to the IMF and say, look, hey, this is what we feel is to be a sustainable path that balances these requirements between fiscal prudence and the requirements of growth in the economy, and then negotiate around that. So the IMF today is very different to the IMF what it was in, say, the 1990s or the 1980s. At that time, I think there was much lesser balance between, say, the social, there was much less sensitivity towards the socio-political situation in some of these recipient countries. But now that balance has shifted to a great extent. So I think there's a much better chance for a country which is smart enough to negotiate the right kind of program to strike a balance between their own national interests and achieving its objectives in terms of building the confidence that is required for a middle-income economy to function in the global market.
I guess that's the most important thing coming out of getting a loan from the IMF. It's the confidence that it instills in other stakeholders who then feel that they can work with us because we have a certain higher degree of credibility more than what we have at the moment. When we come back on our next segment, we're going to look at the potential for the future. What options lie ahead? What else can be done on the next segment of the Sri Lankan Understanding? Welcome back to the Sri Lankan Understanding. We're in conversation with Deshal de Mel, and we're looking at ways and means through which we can address the Forex challenges of Sri Lanka. Deshal, as we go forward, we know that the IMF is one solution that is being touted in terms of addressing the concerns that exist at the moment. What are some of the short-term measures that we can take in this country in order to improve confidence, to ensure that we overcome the challenge that we are facing right now, because it's pretty critical?
Yeah. No, absolutely. I think critical is the right word. If you look at our existing reserve position against the maturing liabilities that we have over the next 12 months, we know that we have very limited foreign reserves available or foreign exchange available to pay for even our most basic imports, which is why we are seeing threats of power outages, concerns about availability of fuel and many other key commodity that are imported. We see a lot of challenges around that. So there's certainly a requirement for urgent action to address this. I would think that the path Sri Lanka needs to embark upon without any further delay is to enter into negotiations with our creditors in order to restructure our future debts. That way, what we would be able to achieve is by coming into an agreement where you delay some of these payments, we are able to buy a little bit of time to take measures, to take steps that can address the longer term issues. Now, by entering into negotiations to restructure our debt, what we will do is then we'll free up some of our reserves to be able to pay for some of these critical imports that we need for the economy to function, for people to effectively to consume normally and to get on with life. Of course, this will also immediately create some kind of challenges, because when you enter into a restructuring agreement, that also there are negative perceptions around that. It creates risks as well. Typically, what creditors would also demand in such a situation is that the country enters into an IMF program to build that confidence that we spoke about earlier. So by having that combination of an IMF program in parallel with the restructuring of our debt, we'll be able to unlock some of these critical capital inflows that will help us to rebuild our reserves, to stabilize the economy to some extent, whilst we restructure our debts and then create the space for the economy to function as normal. Of course, as I said, this is not something, either path that Sri Lanka takes right now is not going to be a bed of roses. It's not cost-free, it's not risk-free. But I would say that this path of restructuring our debt right now is the most prudent way of sharing the cost of adjustment. Right now, the cost of adjustment is entirely borne by the citizens, whereas it would make more sense for that cost to be shared between our creditors and the citizens in a fair manner, so that both parties are not going to get completely trodden upon, and you strike the right balance. So that is the kind of negotiation that Sri Lanka needs to go in right now as an immediate short-term measure to address the most pressing challenges that we face.
If you look at the bigger picture, in the long term, what does the country need to do?
So in the longer term, what Sri Lanka needs to do is to put in place measures that can help generate non-debt creating inflows over a longer period of time. So non-debt creating inflows typically refers to foreign direct investment, exports, tourism, remittances. Now, if we look at some of these, if you look at FDI and exports in particular, they require really a more competitive environment to be able to function. They need competitive markets in land, competitive markets in labor in particular. So if we take two steps, one I would suggest is in terms of land. That's a critical requirement for FDI right now. Most of the FDI zones that we have are at almost full capacity. So there's a critical requirement to invest in new FDI zones that has the required utilities in a reliable and a cost-effective manner that can enable industries to come and set up. That ideally would want to have export-oriented FDI as our kind of key source of FDI for an economy of our nature. A second challenge would be, of course, access to labor. Now, Sri Lanka, we know, even though we have relatively low levels of unemployment, we also have pretty weak labor force participation. And the key driver of this poor labor force participation is the fact that we only have about between 30 and 34% of women who are participating actively in the labor force. Many women choose to not participate in the labor force, and there are certain policy measures that we can put in place to unlock this, and that would automatically help more women to participate in the labor force, because you do have a lot of women who are educated, who have gone through the university system, but do not find a conducive labor force environment to be able to contribute to the economy. So policies such as the government sharing in maternity leave benefits, that is one that has been seen globally to have an important effect on helping more women into the labor force. Flexible working conditions. I think the pandemic has taught us that there are significant opportunities that you can have from working from home. We need to institutionalize those kind of measures again to optimize the level of labor force participation. Flexible hours. Many of these things, investment in daycare, many of these measures can really, without significant cost, be able to really enhance the pool of skilled labor that the economy needs to be able to really, in the longer term, to attract investment, to create a conducive market for export-oriented industries. So these are the kind of measures that we need to really address our longer-term issues with regard to forex availability, to reserves, and the overall export competitiveness of the economy.
This is where, going forward, Deshal, there are lots of things that can be done and must be done if we are going to overcome this, hoping that it will pass, like we're hoping the pandemic will pass. The pandemic is probably here. It's a new norm. I mean, we're living, it's a new way of life. We've got to get used to it. We've got to get the mask, the sanitizer, the vaccinations. These are going to be a part of our life for a good period of time ahead. We're not going to come to a situation where we're going to be able to say, okay, this has improved, this has changed now. So these are things that we probably got to address as we go forward. So thank you very much for taking time to join us today, Deshal, and for giving us this overview, this analysis of what our forex problems are, why we are facing these challenges. When we come back, And the next episode of the Sri Lankan Understanding will take up another aspect of this country. We'll look at where we have been, what issues we are facing at the moment, and what potential there is in the years ahead on our next episode of the Sri Lankan Understanding.